Hi everyone. This week we'll be talking about values, which is one of the 7 core elements to the organizational ecosystem. And as we advance in our discussions, please keep in mind we have micro and macro ecosystems that we're dealing with. But this week we're focusing on values. And values, this core element really is the foundational core element. It is the foundation on which many of the other core elements are built upon. And usually when a leader is constructing, intentionally crafting the ecosystem, he or she begins with values. And the other core elements kind of come into play. And later we'll learn more about this when we talk about the last core element, which is the leadership core element. But this week we're focused on values. And if we take a look at our lecture notes, we'll see at the start, at the top, we have 3 major aspects that we need to absorb. First, values are an ecosystem's standards for discerning what is good and just in the organization. So values sets a bar, so to speak. And also values often suggest how people should behave, but keep in mind they do not accurately reflect how people actually do behave. So we have this difference in the ecosystem. And lastly, values help shape an organizational ecosystem and are fluid. And this will align with our last discussion when we get to it on leadership, where we will talk at some length on how the ecosystem evolves. It's constantly changing, and we will see that with the values core element on how values are fluid and values do change. Again, when we talk about values, a company's values are the core of its ecosystem. It is the foundation on which the other core elements are constructed. Our focused, well-defined and written value statements should shape behavior and is an action process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Values are intentional, crafted by the leader, both micro and macro level. And what that means is at the macro level, the organization can have a series of values. At the micro level, the department or the functional level, you can have a set of values that could be different, but nonetheless should be supporting the macro level. And values must reflect a company's ethos, their ethics, their morals, and values should evolve as the organization evolves. So very important concepts when we talk about values. But we'll start off, and again, values suggest how we want people to behave. But there's a difference between how we want them to behave and how they actually do behave. And again, some of the other core elements will help transform those behaviors in those employees. How do we look at values and how do we look at beliefs? They're 2 different things. Values are standards, and they are an ecosystem standard for discerning what is good and just. So a value statement should be a standard. This is what a person must aspire to. This is how a person must behave. And there's criticality to it. Values are deeply embedded and critical for transmitting that behavior and teaching the ecosystem's beliefs. Now, what are beliefs? Beliefs are convictions that employees are asked to hold to be true, and values and beliefs, employees in an organizational ecosystem have specific beliefs, but they also share collective values. So there is synergy between values and beliefs, and we'll see that in a couple of examples right now. But don't look at values and beliefs as one and the same. They are 2 distinct, separate concepts. Now, let's take a look at this example here. To illustrate the difference between values and beliefs, employees will commonly believe that anyone who works hard enough will be successful. Underlying this belief is the value that success is good and important. So that gives you an understanding of the difference between values and beliefs. You can have a value that success is important in an organization, and the belief to get to that value is you have to work hard to get there. So values help shape an organizational ecosystem by suggesting what is good and bad, what is beautiful and ugly, what is to be sought, what is to be avoided. It establishes rules. It establishes standards. It says what is critical. What is important, living up to an organizational ecosystem's values, however, can be difficult. And we'll see this. An example, it's easy to value success, but for some folks it may be hard to learn a new job. At one organization where I worked, I remember sitting down with an employee. This was in a pharmaceutical company, and the employee worked in vial pack. So this was basically employees who would take syringes and take pharmaceutical vials and help the equipment to package them and then bring them to the warehouse for shipment. It's an important job. It's not the most critical job. The most critical job in this particular pharmaceutical company was working in the clean room. And I remember sitting down with one of the vial packaging individuals, a long-term employee, a good employee, and I remember sitting down with him, and his name is Harold. I said, Harold, have you ever thought about moving into the clean room? The clean room is the most critical position we have on the pharmaceutical manufacturing floor, and the compensation, it definitely pays more. And Harold, who had been there for 15, maybe 20 years, sat there and said, I appreciate that. I understand that the clean room position is extremely important and critical to the organization. I'm going to stay in vial pack. For Harold, he didn't want to take the risk to learn a new job and to lose out on what he had in vial pack, which was stability. So how an organization or a leader looks at success is oftentimes different than how the individual employee looks at success. I looked at the clean room as being that's where you need to be. That's where success lies. Harold's success was where he was. So another example, at a macro level, cultural diversity and equal employment opportunities for all people are valued. That is a value that most, if not all, organizations have. However, there remains wage variances among people of color and women. So we have this value in organizations, but the value isn't practiced. The standard isn't met. It isn't viewed as being critical to many leaders as other leaders. So we have this dichotomy here, and you'll see this right here. Values portray an ideal ecosystem, the standards an organization would like to embrace and live up to. But the ideal ecosystem differs from reality, differs from the real ecosystem and the way the organization is, based on what actually occurs and exists. This difference is where change must occur. And if you go back to your prior learnings from other courses, remember what change is. Change is taking an organization, either at the macro or micro level, from a current state to a more desired state. And so sometimes the values that we have don't necessarily portray reality. And that means it's really up to the leader to make a change. And change is always an action process, right? Very, very important. So when we analyze values, we have 6 key questions or areas that we want to look at to help in determining the sustainability of identified values. When we talk about sustainability, we do want those values to hang around as long as possible, understanding that there will be changes as the marketplace forces changes on the organization or internally as changes are brought to us. So what we look at, we take a look at reward, regardless of reward. What core values do you bring to your work? Values you hold to be so fundamental that you would hold them regardless of whether or not they are rewarded. That is a key identifier when a leader is crafting values. Bringing it home, how would you describe to your loved ones the core values you stand for in your work and that you hope they stand for in their working lives? Here you want the values to be portable. You want to ensure that the values you have at the workplace are going to align with the values that individuals have at home. That's difficult. It's not easy, but you try to actually use that as a screening tool when you are hiring individuals. You want your values at the workplace to be portable to the home. Forever core values. If you awoke tomorrow morning with enough money to retire for the rest of your life, would you continue to hold on to those core values? Again, portability, sustainability. And then you look at longevity values. Can you envision these values being as valid 100 years from now as they are today? So again, your focus is on sustainability. Are those standards, are those critical values you have today, do you think they'll be around 5 years, 10 years, 100 years from now? And if not, then are they correct values for you today? Market pressure on values, you're always going to have that. Would you want the organization to hold these values, even if at some point one or more of them became a competitive disadvantage? Sometimes your values can be a competitive disadvantage. And all you have to do is look at brick and mortar retailers and some of the values that they have held and how those values became a competitive disadvantage, particularly with online shopping. And then from scratch, if you were to start a new organization tomorrow in a different line of work, what core values would you build into the new organization, regardless of its activities? So as a leader, whether it's at the micro or macro level, when you begin to craft those values, when you begin to identify what is critical, what should the standards be, you sort of put them against these 6 testing scenarios to see how they hold up. Very, very critical. Next, we want to put values into action. And in doing that, sometimes it requires sanctions. And when we talk about sanctions, we're going to talk about really the difference between the ideal ecosystem, which is sort of nirvana, where there's no procedural violations, there's no claims of unfairness, things are perfect, everyone is living up to the values, the standards, those items that are critical. In reality, we know, however, that doesn't exist. Leaders are always working to prevent procedural violations. They're always working to repair procedural violations or claims of unfairness. So how do we put values into action? We use sanctions. And sanctions are rewards and punishments that encourage people to live according to the organizational ecosystem's ideas about what is good, what is right, what the standards are. When an employee observes the norms and upholds the ecosystem values, they're often rewarded. Let's take a look at what the leader does. Positively sanction certain behaviors by giving their support, approval, or permission. So leaders will use a positive sanction to give their support to behaviors that are on the right path, to behaviors that support the values. It may be support, it may be approval, it may be permission. On the other hand, negative sanctions. Here is where the leader will invoke formal policies or disapprove or non-support behaviors of employees. So it gets back to the core element of metrics, rewards, and punishments of an incentive infrastructure, and we see that here. So the leader will use the tools he or she has to either push an individual towards the values or invoke certain policies and disapproval, non-support, and take them away from perhaps values that are not what the organization deems suitable. This gets to organizational control. And you'll see control. Sanctions are a form of organizational control, a way to encourage conformity. Conformity, positive sanctions. Sometimes employees conform to values in anticipation or expectation of positive sanctions, positive rewards. Conformity on negative sanctions. Sometimes employees conform to norms in anticipation, expectation of a negative sanction, or because of receiving a negative sanction, such as corrective action or even separation of employment. But control is important, and using organizational control pushes most employees to conform to the values, to the rules, regardless of whether leaders are present. Now, let me ask you, if you are working, take your employer's employee handbook. There probably is one page or maybe 2 pages where they talk about the organization's values. Look at those values. Then take a look at the incentive infrastructure that organization has. How is it designed to sanction either positively or negatively the behaviors of employees? But then I want you to do something even more critical. Take the value statements that your employer has. Take their performance management evaluation system, maybe the form that a leader will use to evaluate an employee. Take a look at the elements on that performance evaluation form against the values. Do they align? A good organization will ensure that all of its processes, to include performance management, performance evaluation, will ensure that the values are on that form or somewheres in that form. That's a good test to do. That's something that I would encourage you to do, and it gives you an indication of how the organization speaks to their values, or if they speak to their values at all. If there is no organizational control over a company's values, then those values are simply words on paper. And that is a huge trap for organizations. Why is it a huge trap? Many organizations try to retain employees and recruit new employees based upon promoting these values. But if they do not have control mechanisms in place, then the values are not realized, and chances are there's high turnover. As we continue, we look at the very simple premise that organizational values are not static. They are fluid. They will evolve. They should evolve. Many ecosystem values over time will lose meaning. Why? Because they were crafted in the past, in a different time, in a different marketplace, with different internal and external forces on that. Very important to understand. So when we talk about fluidity, we talk about values that must be fluid. They must change over time. Sometimes they will change quickly and always in response to internal and external forces. They will change on the macro level, they will change on the micro level. And usually what will happen is the micro level set of values throughout the organization in the various functions, in the various departments, will change more quickly than the macro. When that happens, then leadership at the top of an organization will notice the value changes and will percolate those changes up at the macro level. And values will vary across time and between groups as people evaluate, they debate, they change collective organizational beliefs. And values may also vary within the ecosystem on the micro level. So you are always going to have that dichotomy. A perfect example is, even though I personally believe that every organization should have a value of attention to detail, it is more critical and tends to be a higher standard in, let's say, an accounting department than in some other units. However, as there's influences from, let's say, regulatory entities, attention to detail, that value will increase in its standard and its criticality throughout the organization. For example, in human resources, and I've been doing it for many years, attention to detail was always there, but it wasn't extremely critical. When automated systems came about and there was the necessity for more regulatory reporting, attention to detail became extremely critical. And we're actually seeing this now with the pandemic and throughout the organization. There are new rules and regulations that have to be followed. You have to modify your payroll systems, your HRIS systems, even in accounting, with some of the new deductions that companies can take on their taxes based upon COVID payments made to employees. Again, requires another level of attention to detail. So values, standards, the criticalness of these aspects can change over time. And we can see that here with the attention to detail. And you'll see the example here. If Tiffany and Company kept the same values from when they were a stationery company back in 1837, and that's how they started, they probably would not be dazzling as many customers as they are today. So values change. And at the macro level, if senior leadership is on their game, they're always looking at changing values and that alignment. Let's take a look at some sample values that we see many organizations have. We'll see 9 of them here. Agility, the need for employees to be able to quickly respond and effectively to changes in the marketplace, to be nimble, to seize on new opportunities. Collaboration, very important, employees working together. Some companies are more siloed than others. At Burn Dairy, we were very siloed. It was just kind of the nature of that organization and of the industry. And silos are not necessarily bad. I always say it all depends on the thickness of the silo wall. Customer-centric. Some organizations more customer-centric than others, but employees putting customers first at the center of everything they do. The difficulty with the customer-centric value is, depending on where you are in the organization, the customer is very far away and you don't have that relationship. A perfect example, again, with Burn Dairy, we would bring that customer-centric philosophy to our employees in this way. If you were working on a production line, actually filling the milk in the bottle or in the carton, we didn't want you to view your customer as the person who's buying our product from the grocer. No, we wanted you to view the customer as the employees in the cooler, because that was the next step. So your customer is who is next in line. You wanted to make sure everything that came off your line was perfect for the cooler so that they could do their job. And then the cooler, their customer, would be the drivers. The cooler would make sure that they picked the right product, staged it within the truck so it was easier for the driver to take from the truck and give to the retailer. So customer-centric, an important value, but it's how you position it. And sometimes in a very large organization or an organization with a lot of moving parts, you position it to the employee as not the end customer, but the person next in line. And that person next in line, that person next in the process could very well be another employee. Diversity, company promoting diversity and an inclusive workplace where no one is disadvantaged because of their gender, race, ethnic background, sexual orientation, religion, or nationality. Another way to look at diversity, and I've always said this, is diversity of thought. Make sure that that is a key value as well. It avoids having surrounding leaders with bobbleheads. Execution, very important value. Employees are empowered to act. Always empowered to act within their training and their authority. Very important. Make sure that they have the resources that they need and they adhere to process discipline and are held accountable for their results. So if you have the value of execution, within it you have some other values that are critical, including, as you will see, accountability. Innovation, company pioneers novel products, services, technologies, or ways of working. The difficulty with the innovation value, not that there's anything wrong with it, in many organizations, innovation stems from the research and development function or that department. However, if you have innovation as a value, you are asking all employees to look to avoid the status quo, look to trying to do things differently. So even though we're defining innovation as novel products, services, and technologies, look at the last segment, or ways of working. So every employee can participate in innovation. Integrity goes without saying, to act honest and in an ethical manner. And this is a value that you definitely want to see that's portable when the employee is outside of the workplace. Remember, we talked about that earlier. Performance, we reward as an organization. A critical value, a standard, is to reward results and respect. Employees demonstrate consideration and courtesy for others and treat each other with dignity. Again, one of those values that you want to see, but you also want to see that as portable outside the workplace. When you look at this set of 9 sample values, again, and going back to what I spoke about earlier, how would an organization control that? Would they put those elements in a performance evaluation system? Would they put those elements in an exit interview when the leader or the HR person is sitting down with the employee who's going to be leaving? Would they bring up these values? Would they dare get feedback from the employee who's leaving? Would they look at these values in other areas? How would you organizationally control these values? So again, wonderful words on paper, you need to control those words. Make sure that leaders and employees at all levels act upon them. And you do that through organizational control, making sure there's action. Also, what's important in the lecture notes is I've put down some values from some organizations. And in many situations already, these values have changed. You'll see values from American Express. You'll see integrity. You'll see teamwork, the customer commitment, quality, good citizenship, a will to win, personal accountability, respect for others. Again, great values. How do you control it? Google. Now, Google has some different values, kind of values that you don't see. Where American Express, those values were kind of values that most organizations have. With Google, you see something different, and it's worth looking at. Focus on the user, and all else will follow. That's very important. The user could be the customer. The user could be a fellow employee. And what they're saying is that is really how we're going to define success. Second, it's best to do one thing really, really well. Now, that is probably a value that's not going to work in other organizations. It's not going to work in an organization where you look for generalists. It'll work in an organization where you look for specialists. So again, values are not always portable within industries or between organizations. And you'll see fast is better than slow. Again, good maybe for Google, not good for some other organizations. Democracy on the web works. You don't need to be at your desk to need an answer. That's an interesting value. You can make money without doing evil. There's always more information out there. The need for information crosses all borders. You can be serious without a suit. I wish that value was around when I first started back in the 80s. And great just isn't good enough. So there's a lot of interesting values from Google, and some of these values no longer are there, that they've made some modifications. But these are values that are not necessarily portable to other organizations, just to their organization and to that industry. You'll see Coca-Cola, leadership, collaboration, integrity, accountability, passion, diversity, quality, kind of very basic. And Whole Foods, and I believe these values for Whole Foods were before they were purchased by Amazon. We satisfy and delight our customers. We promote team member growth and happiness. We care about our communities and the environment. We practice win-win partnerships with our suppliers. So it's interesting to look at the values of other organizations to compare them to your values. It's also interesting to see and ask yourself, how do they control those values? What organizational controls do they use? Do they put in place? How do they screen possible employees or candidates for those values? So very, very interesting concepts to go through. At the end of the day, what is important about values is to understand they are standards, they are critical. That leadership either pushes folks to those values using sanctions or takes them away from values that are not the organization's values. It's also important to understand that you have to take action on values. And in order to do that, the organization has to put in organizational controls. And lastly, values are fluid. They evolve over time. And the evolution occurs both on micro and macro levels. But there also has to be alignment between those levels. I hope you enjoyed today's review of our lecture notes, and as always, please be safe. Thank you.